There are moments when obsession swallows you whole, dragging you down into the darkest corners of your mind. That's what happened to me. This irresistible pull toward a myth, a story passed down in whispers and half-remembered dreams. The final war, they called it, the end of everything we knew. I had spent years chasing rumors, piecing together fragments of ancient texts, forbidden knowledge that no historian dared touch. And now, here I was, standing in the fields of the Somme, in a place where history bowled into something far darker. The poppy fields stretched out in every direction, a sea of red and green swaying in the soft breeze. It was peaceful, beautiful even, but there was something wrong underneath. I could feel it, the weight of the earth beneath my feet. This place was a graveyard, after all, though no one wanted to talk about that. Thousands of men had died here, their bodies torn apart by war, their souls trapped in the soil. But I knew that wasn't the whole story. Something else had fed on their deaths, something ancient and evil, and I was here to find it. Our tour guide was a tall, thin man with a scholarly air about him. He wore a crisp suit, his hair slicked back in a way that felt out of place in the muddy fields. His voice was smooth, calming even, as he spoke of the horrors of World War I. But there was something in his eyes, a glint of amusement, as if he knew a secret the rest of us didn't. I kept my distance from the group, watching him closely. He was too polished, too perfect for this place. My instincts told me not to trust him, but I couldn't walk away, not yet. As the guide led us deeper into the fields, he spoke of bravery, sacrifice, and the senseless slaughter that defined the Somme. I heard the words, but my mind was elsewhere, focused on the ground beneath my feet. Every step felt heavier, like something was pulling me down. I glanced around, trying to shake off the sensation, but the air itself felt wrong. It was thick, almost oppressive, like the weight of the past was pressing down on us all. It was then that I saw it. A flicker at the edge of my vision, something moving beneath the poppies. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the flicker became a shape, a figure rising from the ground. I blinked hard, convinced it was a trick of the light, but when I looked again, the figure was still there. It was a soldier, his face pale and bloodied, his eyes empty. He was reaching for something, or someone, his fingers clawing at the air. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone, swallowed by the earth once more. My heart raced, but I didn't dare say anything. The others hadn't noticed, and the tour guide's voice droned on, oblivious. But I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining it. The dead were here, trapped beneath our feet, and they weren't resting peacefully. I tried to focus on the guide's words, hoping for some explanation, but he only spoke of the living, the soldiers who had fought, bulled, and died for nothing. The dead, it seemed, were not his concern. Suddenly, the air shifted, and the peaceful fields around us began to blur. The sky darkened, the poppies wilting in an instant. I stumbled backward, my vision spinning as the world twisted around me. The ground beneath me cracked open, and I was no longer in the present. I was in the Somme, but not as a tourist. The year was 1916, and the war was still raging. Gunfire echoed in the distance, and the stench of death filled the air. Bodies lay scattered across the battlefield, their faces frozen in terror. But it wasn't just the soldiers I saw. No, something far worse had joined the fight. The dead were rising, their limbs twisted and broken, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. These weren't men anymore. They were something else, something born of war and darkness. Zombies. That was the only word that came to mind, though it didn't do justice to the horror before me. The guide's voice cut through the chaos, cold and sharp. "This is what you came to see, isn't it?" he said, his tone mocking. He stood beside me now, unchanged by the shift in time and reality. His suit was still crisp, his face calm, as if he had seen this all before. "War has always been hell," he continued, "but some wars, some are more literal than others." I couldn't speak. The words caught in my throat as I watched the battlefield transform before my eyes. The soldiers, British, German, it didn't matter, were fighting not just each other but the undead rising from the trenches. It was chaos, a nightmare I couldn't wake from. And through it all, the tour guide smiled. "This is the truth you've been seeking," he said softly. "The myth of the final war isn't a myth at all. It's been happening for centuries, in every conflict, in every war. Hell's forces have always been here, feeding on the dead, turning battlefields into breeding grounds for their armies. I wanted to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the horror unfolding before me. The dead were all around, their moans filling the air, their eyes locked on me. I could feel them pulling at me, dragging me down into the earth with them. And still, the tour guide watched, his smile never wavering. You wanted the truth, he said. Now you have it. And in that moment, I realized that there was no going back. I had crossed a line, stepped into a world that wasn't meant for the living. And the dead, it seemed, weren't finished with me yet. I couldn't shake the horror of what I'd just witnessed. The dead clawing their way out of the trenches, the living soldiers barely aware of the true enemy in their midst. That moment in the psalm had shattered any illusions I held. War wasn't just a human conflict. It was hell's playground, and I had been blind to it all along. But I barely had time to process before the ground beneath me shifted again, the sky blurring, reality twisting around me like a whirlwind. Before I knew it, I was somewhere else. Another battlefield, another war. This time, it wasn't the muddy trenches of World War I. No, the smell of salt water and gunpowder hit me first, followed by the deafening roar of artillery fire. I looked up to see the sky dark with smoke, the beach in front of me littered with the bodies of soldiers. Omaha Beach, 1944. D-Day, one of the bloodiest moments in human history. And yet I knew that, once again, I wasn't just here to witness a battle between men. The chaos was overwhelming. I saw Allied troops storming the beaches, trying to push forward under a relentless hail of bullets from the German bunkers. But something else was happening, something far worse. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the water churn violently, as if something massive lurked just beneath the surface. My heart pounded as I watched the ocean itself rise up, and from its depths emerged a horror I could barely comprehend. A creature, no, a monster, broke through the waves, its serpentine body towering above the battlefield. The Leviathan. That's the name that came to mind, though no word could fully capture the sheer terror of what I was seeing. It moved with terrifying grace, dragging men into the water with its colossal tentacles, tearing apart the landing crafts as if they were made of paper. This wasn't a fight between nations. This was hell on earth. I turned to the tour guide, who stood beside me as calmly as ever, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the carnage with a slight smile. They never stood a chance, he murmured, as though we were watching nothing more than a poorly rehearsed play. You see, war always feeds something greater. In every conflict, in every moment of bloodshed, hell grows stronger. His words sickened me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. The Allied soldiers continued their desperate charge, but it was futile. The Leviathan was unstoppable, a force beyond anything the men on the beach could have imagined. And it wasn't alone. From the smoke and flames, I saw other creatures, harpies, their grotesque wings beating the air as they swooped down to snatch soldiers from the ground. These were hell's true soldiers, the ones hidden from history books and military reports. What do you want from me? I demanded, my voice barely audible over the din of battle. The tour guide glanced at me, his expression unreadable. You sought the truth, didn't you? You wanted to understand the myth of the final war. Well, here it is, laid bare for you to see. Every war you've ever studied, every battle you've ever thought of as a struggle between men, was something far more sinister. Hell has always been here, pulling the strings, turning men into pawns. My mind raced, struggling to make sense of it all. This was more than I had ever bargained for. I had come looking for the truth, yes, but not like this. Not this nightmare. I watched as the Leviathan dragged soldiers into the ocean's depths, their screams silenced by the waves. The air was thick with the smell of death and salt water, and for a moment I thought I might drown in the horror of it all. And then she appeared. At first, I barely noticed her, a small, elderly woman moving through the chaos as if untouched by the violence around her. She didn't belong here. That much was clear. But neither did I. Her eyes met mine. And for the briefest moment, the noise of the battlefield seemed to fade away. There was something familiar about her, something calming in the midst of all this terror. She approached me slowly, her steps deliberate. You shouldn't be here, she said softly, her voice cutting through the madness. This is not your fight. I blinked, trying to make sense of her words. Who are you? I asked, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze to the tour guide, her eyes narrowing. There was something between them, an unspoken tension that I couldn't quite place. This one is under my protection, she said, her voice firm now, no longer the gentle tone she had used with me. The tour guide raised an eyebrow, amused. Is that so? He said, his voice dripping with mockery. You always did have a soft spot for lost souls. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt a glimmer of hope. The tour guide might have been powerful, but he wasn't the only one. This woman, whoever she was, had a strength that went beyond what I could see, and she was here for me. Come with me, she said, reaching out her hand. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the tour guide, whose smile had faded into something colder, more menacing. But I knew I had no choice. Whatever this woman was offering, it was my only way out. I took her hand, and the world shifted again. The sounds of battle faded, the cold sea breeze replaced by something else, something far more sinister. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. I had only just begun to glimpse the true face of hell's influence on history, and I knew that wherever this woman was taking me next, the horrors would only grow darker. But for the first time, I wasn't alone. I barely had a chance to catch my breath before I found myself thrust into another time, another place. The world around me was heavy with humidity, thick with the scent of wet earth and vegetation. The oppressive heat clung to my skin, and the buzzing of insects filled the air. We were in Vietnam now, 1968, I realized, the height of the war. The jungle stretched out before me, dense and unforgiving, a maze of foliage where danger lurked behind every tree. But this wasn't just the war I had read about in history books. No, hell had its claws here too, digging deep into the hearts of men. I could hear it before I saw it, the distant sound of gunfire, the sharp cracks echoing through the jungle. The old woman still by my side walked with a steady calmness that seemed at odds with the chaos all around us. She said nothing, but her presence was enough to keep me moving, even as my heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what horrors awaited me here, but I knew they would be nothing like the history I had once studied. As we moved deeper into the jungle, I heard something else, something far more terrifying than the gunfire. It was a low growl, primal and menacing, vibrating through the trees. My skin prickled with fear. "What is that?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. This was no ordinary battle. Hell's soldiers were here, too, hidden in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike. We reached a small clearing, and that's when I saw them. The werewolves. They were massive, hulking beasts with matted fur and blood-red eyes. Their fangs gleamed in the dim light filtering through the trees, and their claws, razor-sharp and dripping with blood, tore through the soldiers as if they were nothing more than paper. American and Vietnamese troops alike were caught in the carnage, their screams filling the air as the werewolves descended upon them with brutal efficiency. This wasn't just a battle between men. This was a massacre. My body froze in terror as I watched the scene unfold. The werewolves moved through the soldiers like ghosts, silent and deadly, leaving nothing but death in their wake. I could see the fear in the soldiers' eyes, the realization that they were no longer fighting a war they understood. This was something far darker, something they couldn't comprehend. And yet they fought on, desperate, hopeless. The old woman grabbed my arm, pulling me back before the werewolves could notice us. "We can't stay here," she whispered urgently, her calm demeanor cracking just enough to reveal the gravity of the situation. "These creatures, they're not meant for this world. They're here because of the chaos, the bloodshed. Hell thrives in war, and now its creatures roam free." I stumbled after her, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. I had read about the Vietnam War, seen the images, heard the stories of the brutality and horror. But this was something else entirely. The jungle wasn't just a battleground. It was a hunting ground for creatures that shouldn't exist. As we pushed deeper into the jungle, the sounds of the battle faded, but the feeling of dread didn't. It clung to me like the humidity, suffocating and relentless. The old woman's grip on my arm was firm, her pace steady as we moved through the thick underbrush. I wanted to ask her so many questions about the werewolves, about the tour guide, about why I was here, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was follow her, my mind racing with fear and confusion. After what felt like hours, we emerged from the jungle onto a small hill overlooking a river. The sun was beginning to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the landscape. The river below was stained red with blood, the bodies of soldiers, both human and otherwise, floating lifelessly in the water. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare, and yet it was real as the ground beneath my feet. The old woman stood beside me, her eyes scanning the horizon. "This is what war brings," she said softly, her voice filled with a sadness that cut through the horror. "Hell has always fed on humanity's darkest moments. War, suffering, death. It all fuels them, makes them stronger. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Why show me this? I asked, my voice shaking. Why bring me here? She turned to face me, her eyes filled with a kind of compassion I hadn't expected. Because you need to see it, she said. You need to understand that the final war is not just a myth. It's already happening, piece by piece, battle by battle. Hell's forces are already here, and they are growing stronger with each conflict. You sought the truth, didn't you? Well, this is the truth. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but I knew there was no escape. The truth was laid bare before me, and it was far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The final war wasn't some distant, future event. It was happening right now, in the jungles of Vietnam, on the beaches of Normandy, in the trenches of the Somme. Hell was here, and it was winning. The old woman placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch warm and comforting despite the cold dread in my chest. But you're not alone, she said quietly. There are forces fighting back, forces that won't let hell take this world without a fight. You've seen the darkness, but there is light too. You just have to be willing to see it. Her words gave me a small measure of comfort, but the weight of what I had seen still pressed heavily on my shoulders. The tour guide's words echoed in my mind, his voice dripping with mockery and malice. Hell's forces had always been here, feeding on our wars, our suffering. But the old woman's presence was a reminder that there was more to the story, that not all hope was lost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the jungle into shadow, I knew that my journey was far from over. The horrors I had witnessed in Vietnam were only a glimpse of what was to come. The final war was still unfolding, and I had a part to play in it, whether I wanted to or not. But for now, all I could do was follow the old woman and hope that her light would be enough to guide me through the darkness ahead. The world shifted again, and this time it felt different, colder, heavier, as though the weight of reality itself had grown thicker, more oppressive. I could feel it in my bones before I even opened my eyes. The air smelled burnt and metallic, a scent that clawed at my throat as I inhaled. When I finally looked up, the sight that greeted me was one of pure devastation. London, or what was left of it, was a ruin. The familiar skyline was nothing more than jagged silhouettes against a darkened sky, broken buildings and crumbling landmarks swallowed by dust and ash. What should have been the heartbeat of a bustling city was eerily silent, save for the occasional distant roar, a sound that made my stomach twist. This wasn't the London I had visited in the past, full of life and history. This was something else entirely, a vision of what could be, what might be if Hell's forces continued their march unchecked. The old woman stood beside me, her face grim as she surveyed the destruction. This is what they want, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the suffocating silence. A world where humanity falls, where hope is nothing but a memory. This is what the final war leads to, a future where hell reigns supreme. I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy as I took in the sight of this apocalyptic London. Once this place had been a symbol of resilience, surviving wars and bombings, emerging stronger each time. But now it was nothing more than a wasteland, a graveyard of human civilization, and in the streets below I saw the terrifying truth of what had caused it. Demons. Massive, towering creatures roamed the streets, their grotesque forms barely resembling anything human. Some had wings, others lumbered on twisted limbs, but all of them radiated power, dark, malevolent power. They tore through the remains of the city as though it was nothing but rubble, scattering debris and bodies in their wake. Soldiers, British, American, it was hard to tell, fought desperately against them, but it was clear they didn't stand a chance. These demons were unstoppable, and the last remnants of humanity were nothing more than playthings in their path of destruction. I watched in horror as a group of soldiers attempted to set up a barricade, their faces pale and drenched in sweat. But before they could even raise their weapons, a massive demon descended upon them, its claws slicing through their bodies with terrifying ease. Blood splattered the ground, and the soldiers were gone, just like that. There was no mercy, no hesitation. This was the end, and they knew it. They've been fighting for years, the old woman said, her voice tinged with sorrow. The remnants of humanity. They've tried, but how can they fight when hell itself walks the earth? I felt sick, my stomach twisting with the sheer hopelessness of it all. This wasn't just a vision of hell. It was the endgame, the final war come to life. The battles I had witnessed before, the Somme, Omaha Beach, Vietnam. They were just preludes, pieces of a larger puzzle that had been leading to this moment. And now here it was, laid bare before me in all its horrifying glory. The old woman placed a hand on my arm, pulling my attention back to her. "But it's not over," she said, her voice firm despite the destruction around us. "There's still a fight to be had, still a chance to stop this." I shook my head, disbelief and fear coursing through me. "How?" I asked, my voice cracking. "How can we stop this? Look at them. They're unstoppable. There's no way." Her grip on my arm tightened, her eyes fierce as she spoke. "Do not give in to despair. That's what they want. Hell's greatest weapon isn't the demons you see. It's the hopelessness they spread. If you believe there's no chance, then they've already won. But if you fight, if you believe there's something worth saving, then the war isn't over." I didn't know if I believed her. How could I, after everything I had seen? But something in her voice, something in the way she spoke, made me want to hold on, even if just a little. The devastation around me felt insurmountable, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, there was something left to fight for. And then, as if sensing my doubt, the world shifted again. This time, it was different. Not the violent, disorienting shift of before, but something smoother, more deliberate. The cold, ruined streets of London melted away, replaced by something far colder, colder than I had ever experienced. Snow crunched beneath my feet, the air biting at my skin as I found myself standing on a frozen mountaintop. The sky above was a storm of swirling gray clouds, and the wind howled through the jagged peaks like the cry of some ancient, angry god. We were in Greenland now, the woman and I. The shift was abrupt, jarring, but as I looked around, I understood why we were here. This place, it felt like a final battleground. Isolated, freezing, and desolate, it was the perfect place for a confrontation that had been building since the moment I stepped onto that cursed tour. The old woman turned to me, her expression serious. "He's coming," she said simply, and I knew exactly who she meant. I didn't need to wait long. The air around us crackled with energy, the storm above swirling faster, angrier. And then, out of the snow and wind, I saw him. The tour guide, though he no longer looked like the polished academic figure I had first met. His true form was revealed now, a towering demonic figure, his skin dark and cracked like burned earth, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. "So this is where it ends," he said, his voice deeper, more guttural than before. "You should have listened to me. You could have had power, knowledge beyond anything you could imagine. But instead, you chose her." He spat the last word like it was a curse. The old woman stepped forward, placing herself between the tour guide and me. "This ends here," she said, her voice unwavering. "You won't take him, not today." The tour guide laughed, a sound that echoed through the frozen peaks, sending a shiver down my spine. "You think you can stop me? You're a fool." And then the battle began. The old woman, now revealed as something far more than just a protector, shone with a brilliant light, a celestial glow that cut through the storm. Her power clashed with the tour guide's dark energy, and the air around us crackled with the force of their confrontation. I could barely move, barely think, as I watched them fight. A battle between forces I couldn't begin to understand, forces far beyond anything human. The storm raged, the ground shook, and for a moment, I thought it would tear the mountain apart. But through it all, the old woman held her ground, her light never dimming, and slowly, painfully, the tour guide began to falter. His power, vast as it was, couldn't stand against her. Not here, not now. With a final burst of energy, the old woman struck him down, her light overwhelming the darkness. The tour guide let out a roar of fury, but it was too late. He was defeated. And just like that, it was over. The wind died down, the storm eased, and the old woman stood victorious, her breath steady as she turned to face me. There was no triumph in her eyes, only exhaustion, as though the battle had taken everything from her. "It's done," she said softly, though I knew the war was far from over. But for now, there was peace. For now, I was safe. The stillness after the battle felt strange, unsettling even. It was as if the world itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the final blow to land. And now that it was over, the silence pressed in around me, heavy and suffocating. I stood there, on that frozen mountaintop, watching as the old woman, no longer glowing, no longer bathed in celestial light, breathed deeply, her hands resting on her knees. She looked so human in that moment, so fragile, and yet I knew what I had just witnessed. A victory against something far greater than I could ever comprehend. I wasn't sure what to say. How do you thank someone for saving your life, your soul? How do you even begin to understand what it means to be caught between forces that exist on such a monumental scale? My thoughts were racing, tangled up in everything I had seen. The horrors of hell, the manipulation of wars, the looming shadow of the final war that was still out there waiting. Even with the tour guide gone, I knew this wasn't the end. The war wasn't over. You did well, the old woman said, her voice breaking the quiet. She straightened up, meeting my eyes with a tired smile. You stayed strong, even when you wanted to give in. That matters. I didn't feel strong. I felt small, like a child lost in the dark. Is it really over? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Is this it? She shook her head slowly, her expression sad but resolute. No, it's not over. This was just one battle, one moment in the larger fight. Hell's forces are still out there, and they'll keep pushing, keep fighting. But you've seen the truth now. You know what's at stake, and that means you can fight back. The words felt hollow in the face of everything I had seen. How could I possibly fight back? What could I do against demons, against the monsters that tore through history and twisted wars into feeding grounds for hell? I wasn't a soldier, not like the men who had fought and died on those battlefields. I was just me, a truth seeker obsessed with a myth that had turned out to be far more real than I could have ever imagined. As if sensing my doubt, the old woman stepped closer, her eyes softening. You're not alone in this, she said quietly. Humanity isn't alone. There are forces on your side, angels like me. And there are others, people who are waking up to the reality of what's happening. The final war may be coming, but the outcome isn't set in stone. Not yet. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to hold on to the idea that there was hope, that the future wasn't doomed to end in the devastation I had seen in London. But the images of that broken city, the demons roaming the streets, the soldiers fighting a hopeless battle, they clung to me like shadows, refusing to let go. The old woman reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me in the present. You're stronger than you think, she said. You've already survived more than most would, and you've seen the worst of it. The raw, unfiltered horror of hell's influence on the world. That means you know what we're up against, and that makes you dangerous to them. I looked at her, searching for some sign that she was right, that this wasn't just a kind lie meant to comfort me. And in her eyes, I saw something real, something that made me want to believe. Maybe I wasn't as helpless as I felt. Maybe, after everything I'd seen, I had a part to play in this war. Before I could respond, the world began to shift again. The frozen mountaintop blurred and faded, the biting cold replaced by something warmer, more familiar. And then I was back, standing once more in the fields of the Somme. The poppies were swaying gently in the breeze, the sky above clear and bright. It was peaceful here, quiet, as though the horrors of the past had never touched this place. But I knew better. I knew what lay beneath the surface, the countless lives lost, the souls trapped in the earth, feeding something far darker than history had recorded. I turned to the old woman, but she was already moving away, her form blending into the landscape as if she were part of it. Wait, I called after her, my voice catching in my throat. What now? What do I do? She paused, looking back at me with a small, knowing smile. You keep going, she said simply. You keep fighting, in whatever way you can. This war isn't over, but it's not lost either. Remember that. And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the field, the weight of her words settling into my bones. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the poppies, the peacefulness of the scene at odds with everything I knew. The world hadn't changed. The wars were still out there, the battles still raging. Hell's forces hadn't disappeared. They were just waiting, biding their time. But I wasn't the same. I had seen too much, learned too much. The truth wasn't a burden I could put down, not now. It was part of me, woven into the very fabric of my being. And I knew that, no matter what happened next, I couldn't turn away from it. As I walked away from the field, the wind whispering through the grass, I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but beneath it, there was something else, a flicker of hope, small but growing. The old woman had been right. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The final war was coming, and I had a choice to make. I could run, hide from the truth, and pretend that none of this had ever happened. Or I could fight, stand against the darkness, and refuse to let hell take this world without a battle. And for the first time since this journey began, I knew what I had to do. I was going to fight.